Thank you for inviting me to speak about Southwest Marine Ecosystems model. I really want to cover three main topics. First of all, just to basically describe the key elements of how that model works, what SWME reports on, and then explore two ideas, one of which is whether it can be used to help State of the Seas reporting, and the second to see whether it can be replicated for other regions around the UK. I'd like to thank Keith Hiscott, Natasha Bradshaw, Ruth Williams, Matt Frost and Sue Sayer for their help with this. Southwest Marine Ecosystems began with conferences. The initial idea was Russell Winds, who many of you will probably know, with meetings at the Marine Biological Association, and they continued annually for a number of years with about 50 or so delegates attending. He asked me in 2013 whether I'd take that on, and in the process we moved to PML, where the number of delegates grew to over 150 for 3 years, and then since there seemed to be more demand, we actually moved to the Plymouth University, where again the actual numbers of delegates have been expanding, and Natasha Bradshaw has organised the conferences for the last 2 years. The 2020 conference unfortunately had to be cancelled, and so what we decided to do in 2021 was to produce a series of webinars, and they're going extremely well with very large attendances, and our mailings to a contact group are expanded by over twice since we've been starting to do those webinars, and you can sign up for those webinars at the SWME website. If one looks at the conferences and what they cover, essentially what one's trying to do is bring the science and the community together. They're very deliberately, very wide-ranging structure for the conferences, covering everything from natural systems, oceanography, plankton, etc., to cetaceans, and also management, whether it be plastics or MPAs. We have a very clear set of objectives which we've developed. In essence, the idea is to bring scientists and together, and public together, to look across the boundaries, which are often covered by discrete groups of people. It's usually a very busy day, lots of presentations. Networking is one of the big things about the day, bringing people together across these different groups. And you can actually see the speaker notes and presentations from the last 8 or so conferences on the SWME website. It's essentially the key thing that makes SWME work. It's the people. That group, that wider group of people, is expanding very rapidly now. If you look at segments of people who are involved, the last conference we ran, over 70 organisations attended. SWME has got a steering committee now. We also have a number of chapter editors who are responsible for the annual report. And the other thing to point out, which keeps on occurring to me, is there are lots of networks operating in the Southwest, and we plug into all of those. In 2014, I started the idea of an annual online report based on the idea of bird reports. And again, we've got some clear objectives for these. And if anyone wants to read these, you can read them in the archive, which is on the website. Again, these follows a very traditional structure. There are chapters on oceanography, plankton, benthos, and management issues, fisheries, MPAs, and plastics. There's a volunteer editor for each chapter, often working with a number of other colleagues in teams, essentially collecting information from many sources, which I'll cover in a minute. The actual document and approach is developing very significantly year on year. It started off at 24 pages, and it's now gone up to 80 pages. It has a DOI number and was published formally by the Marine Biological Association last year. So that covers the sort of the basic model of SWME. And I want to look at what SWME reports on. And to do that, I want to talk about observations and description in science, because it's very relevant to what SWME does. And I like this quote from Sir Arthur Tansley, who basically said, every kind of scientific investigation has two stages, the descriptive and the analytical. We must first clearly know what the phenomena are, the things or processes we propose to investigate, and thus we must be carefully observe and accurately record before we proceed to find out how particular phenomena come about. Very relevant to SWME and what it does. And you can, and this infographic sort of really summarizes that. In essence, what we see with a lot of what SWME does is it provides a kind of contextual background basis for further studies, answering questions, more analysis. So looking at recording and data and evidence, SWME promotes recording schemes, and there are lots of recording schemes that are relevant to the Southwest. Some are specific to the Southwest, others are nationwide, but these are covered on our website. SWME does not hold data, but obviously we know lots of people who do. For the annual reports, the sources of information, the main source of information, come from really four main sources. Personal sources and contacts of the editors, comes from Citizen Science Project, and here the growth in mobile phones and social media essentially are working together to provide a huge willingness to report on sightings using that mechanism. And then there are obviously the formal reports from agencies and research papers that are produced within the area. There's a very long tradition of reporting, long tradition reporting on citizen science in the Southwest dating to the 1970s. But in any event, in the Southwest, this really began with Stella Turk and the systematic recording of Strandings network, cetacean strandings network, and it's a model that's been replicated in the UK. And it's a perfect example because on one level there one gets sightings and strandings which provide the context of what's going on, but then these exceptional events, and this one likely be caused by a naval sonar in 2008. This slide shows a number of things which actually, it's difficult to necessarily describe these perfectly, but I'll illustrate them with these four different examples. Rhizostoma, the barrel jellyfish, sometimes is astonishingly common and does astonishingly well. In other years, not at all. We've also got to become very familiar with the strandings of the Atlantic siphonophores, Physalia and Velella. Octopus vulgaris sometimes occurs very commonly. But we know about the fact that there are certain plague years because the NBA has reported on a number of occasions. So over the last 100 years. So this is not a climate change effect. Okay. As they say in the Southwest, one Dalmatian pelican doesn't make a spring, but it illustrates the sort of things that people report on. And we're becoming much more familiar now with events, especially storms, and the effects that they can produce, and either washing out the benthos, or in relation to seal mortality, for example. There are those sightings that occur for the first time. They're novel, they're new, and then something about these things happens and changes. We notice with tuna and spiny lobsters. What turned out as novel sightings has now become, led to major studies, major science studies, and major challenges for management in both cases. And we can see, from the work that Sea Search has done, for example, on how the spiny lobsters have really gone from a very low level to a very high level. The reverse is also happening in certain situations, and basking shark sightings in the Southwest have become really much less frequent over 20 or so years, quite a long time, but certainly from Cornwall, these have been very, very noticeable. And there's no obvious explanation at the moment, but from the work that PML have done on Calanus, and again, which is reported in the annual report, we can see that Calanus hollandicus isn't doing desperately well either. And these two things obviously might link a little bit together. Also, the sightings give us a kind of spatial context. And I want to use one particular example, which is pertinent to my interest on sea watching here. I've sat at the start point often and watched the seabirds. It can be remarkably dull. So when 400 Manx shearwaters fly by per hour, thousands of birds flying up channel, it is really a very significant event. But then you get to a question about where they've come from. Huge numbers of animals. That really the only area that they could have come from are the Pembrokeshire Islands where they nest. So they're obviously coming around Granite Head up into Lyme Bay. And we know Lyme Bay is a destination because Marine Life have reported this, and huge numbers of animals in Lyme Bay in the summer feeding. But this is not unusual for the species you find in the southwest. I mean, it's a perfect example from Soosayer in relation to seal migrations, but also bass, tag bass are known to use the whole of the southwest in terms of where they come, they feed and the areas they use. And then another important point is that there are some seriously expert naturalists who are reporting on new species that haven't been recorded for a long time, or new locations for certain species, because they know how to look, they know where to look, they know what they're looking for. Perhaps our star expert naturalist in this category is a guy called Dave Fennick, who reports on all sorts of things. This particular nematine is very important, and he reported it to CFAS immediately because it's known to carry a marked shellfish toxin. It's surprising the number of links there are to kind of management related issues. You'll all be very aware of discarded fishing gear, and this slide from Soosayer just shows the scale of the problem, both in terms of its extent of the gear, but also in terms of its impact on seals. But in fact, large numbers of the observations that we receive routinely and report on in the annual report are linked to management. Some of them, like the seabird recovery story, is a really great story about effectively what's happened since rat eradication on the Scilly Isles and Lundy Isles and the kind of recovery of seabirds. The PIB incident was a very good example of a kind of one-off event and bird wreck. Biobeads from Southwest Waters site in 2010 has been reported on. Also, the growth of Pacific oysters that are doing exceptionally well around the south coast Brias, and also up as far as Western Supermare. So, Pacific oysters are doing exceptionally well. So that sort of covers the sort of material that we report on. And now to these two questions. But the first is, can SWME be a contribution to the state of the seas assessment? And I think the simple answer to that is yes. I'm sure you're fully aware of management systems and adaptive management, often on long timescales. I mean, it's been part of my career really, ever since the North Sea Ministerial Conferences, which obviously have led on to things like MSFD and now the Marine Strategy. We're used to these things on a long timescale. But Southwest Marine Ecosystems, I think, fills a different niche, really. Essentially, it reports in a timely and relevant way in terms of its annual reports and meetings. It fills a gap, really, because in essence, things happen, often events happen very quickly. The PIB incident was a particular case in point, but science requirements change quickly. You can't wait for 5 years before you instigate your study on bluefin tuna. We've seen this on a number of occasions. Similarly, management requirements change quickly. And again, in that 5-year period, lots of things are changing pretty routinely. And the second reason I think this is relevant to state of the seas is that, in fact, one's reporting on things that are spatially relevant to local and regional, local geographic scales, to people and communities, and managers and communities. And this is a perfect example of the humpback whale that turned up off Slapton Sands. It actually was all around the kind of southwest, but actually spent a couple of weeks off at Slapton. Thousands of people went to watch this. It was a real performance, but it managed to catch itself in fishing gear twice and had to be rescued. So it reinforces by British Divers Marine Life Rescue, but it reinforces the point about, in a sense, engaging people, reporting on what people are seeing, and then and in some cases the need to take action. And it's at a scale that's not so, it's not remote from our interests. It's actually a level that's very relevant to our interests. So the second question really was, can the SWME model be rolled out for other regions? Again, the simple answer to that I think is yes, partly because the UK has a huge tradition of marine science, partly because I think there's a growing awareness and fascination of the sea by a wide range of people. And there's an expanding interest in citizen science and the use of mobile phones and social media for reporting. And I know Dan Lear's in the audience today. I know that he and the people at Dash are looking at this as a challenge, a way of actually making the recordings that are sent in using these mechanisms, can be taken into account more routinely. There's one caveat I think about using this model is that one really has to understand the people and the dynamics of the people, and in fact, obviously lots of volunteers are involved, and essentially you're building, this is a project that essentially is all about building social capital. I mean, I put this diagram in from given to me by Sue Salick. You understand this idea because in a sense you've done a top-down approach with the Clean Catch program. You could quite easily reverse this process to actually make it nationally relevant. So to summarize, this infographic really kind of just, in a certain sense, pulls the whole thing together. We're essentially about bringing science, observations, recording, helping the scientific process. We're linking that to people and networks, and we're doing that in order to make a difference. Heaven only knows there are enough challenges that the marine environment is facing. To summarize it in headlines, SWME can provide the eyes and ears. It can provide an early warning system. It does this by providing an annual report. It is sustainable. If the conferences have been going on for 15 years and the reports for 7, it's based around people, and that the number of people we're contacting is expanding. It's financially self-sufficient because we use lots of volunteers to get this to work, and it's developing. I mean, sometimes it can be messy, but there are lots and lots of very positive things to take from this process. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I just remind you again about the up and coming webinars, which you might find of very great interest. And these are now on one of our volunteers has set up a YouTube channel for us, so you can view these on YouTube. So thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to speak to you all.